Thank you very much. I am honored to be with you. And after these two scintillating panels, really, they were wonderful, lively discussion, very thought-provoking presentations. And I think I do want to congratulate the journal editors, editor-in-chief, the both editors for this particular very special event, and all the editors. And Professor Acharya, it really is a pleasure to see all this wonderful work being done by students. Could you kindly join me in thanking them? And this also especially goes to wonderful speakers. And I was delighted that you inserted human rights at the core of that event. And that was absolutely, absolutely amazing, because it is important to talk about human rights in this context, because that is an important item on our agenda. I know that we are slightly behind. This is a topic on which you could talk for 2 hours or 2 minutes. And what I would do is, I know that your patience is not inexhaustible, and I look around and there are plenty of you who have been here since this morning. So I'm not going to impose upon you more than that time, and I will conclude by, I hope, before 45 after 4, because I might have 1 or 2 questions, and if I can't, then I'll be outside and happy to answer any questions. Especially a couple people here with whom I have taught in the past, and past incarnations, Sir Jim, Mr. Commissioner, Sir Dan, delighted to have you here, and Marianne. And I want you to know, those of you who have been in Spokane and at Gonzaga for some time, that my wife Catherine and I, we were rooting for you, and we were disappointed. But there is always next year. And so all of you who have in 3L taking the bar and going out of Spokane, you can watch next year, as we will be, and I hope that there will be a rosy day again. I have the topic, economic imbalances, technological imbalances, and how they impede the implementation of the 2030 agenda, that agenda on sustainable development and those sustainable development goals. Here sits a person, Professor Best, who has not done simply talking about human rights, but who knows about sustainable development goals, has lived them, worked on them, and so I defer to him. So any issue that you want to take on sustainable development goals, talk with him after the talk. Let me begin, because those of you who have been tired all day, let me tell you what I'm going to do, and you can probably leave after about 1 minute. And I'm going to talk very briefly about the economic inequality. I'm primarily going to talk about economic inequality and the issues, because this morning, actually all day, we have been talking about technological issues and obviously inequality. So my focus would be primarily on the economic inequality. And let's just begin. I think I would like for you to think along with me. And this is a report that you have probably seen occasionally year after year, the United Nations Development Program's ranking, and they rank countries on Human Development Index. That index was developed in 1990 It's a composite statistic of three things: life expectancy, education, and income per capita indicators. And you'll probably notice that the countries that are in the top rank are the ones that you probably might expect: Norway, Switzerland, Australia, but others in the top 12, they include Sweden, Denmark, the Netherlands, Germany, Singapore, and Canada. Now, bottom tier comprises Niger, Central African Republic, South Sudan, Chad, Burundi, Sierra Leone, Burkina Faso, Mali, Liberia, Mozambique, Eritrea, and Yemen. You can probably know, as do I do, you can look at statistic after statistic in trying to see the kind of divide. And here, my friend Taub is going to forgive me because I'm going to talk about global north and global south. So with apologies to you, that's what I'm going to use. And the setting is that this global south, as you can probably know, you have the magnitude of the imbalance. I'll spare you all those statistics, but suffice to say that there is a stark divide between rich or developed and poor or developing countries. Among many of the challenges that at the present time you see beyond these, mostly I could simply mention them without elaborating: slow global economic growth, low levels of investment flows, and stagnant trade. They are further exacerbating that divide. In 2018, IMF, October of that year, last October, it cut global economic forecast, and in January, it again downgraded its projections. There has been a steady decline in African exports. The numbers speak for themselves. Proportion of total world exports that declined from 3.5% in 2012 to 2.4%. And if you look at the manufacturing sector, then again it fell from almost 34% to about 30%. And the point simply that you want to make here is that the difficulty that we see at the present time with all these economic inequalities, that difficulty is seemingly insurmountable at the present time. Among many developed countries today, we are witnessing protectionism, witnessing isolationism, extreme nationalism that is pretty negative in terms of excluding others, exclusive. And among the least developed countries, with population increase, we find growing pressure on natural resources and widespread poverty. These unprecedented challenges, especially global economic, technological imbalance, impediments, they obviously threaten the achievement of sustainable development for all as measured by the Sustainable Development Goals. I was just looking at this September 2018 General Assembly debates. And you have presidents of countries, United Nations officials, each one lamenting that these economic imbalances, technological imbalances, they might not permit us to reach those goals that we have set in 2015. You probably remember that from 2000 to 2015, the world community had set Millennium Development Goals. And then after a great deal of soul searching, they decided that they would like to improve upon what had been accomplished, and they would set from 2015 to 2030. In these 15 years, some more goals to be set, and I'll talk briefly about those goals, but it's a very, very, I think, enlightening, interesting story. That story needs to be mentioned, and I would like to look at those sustainable development goals, but before that, Millennium Development Goals, and before that, just very short look into this development scenario. You recall that after the Second World War, in a very simple terms, if we want to look at it, American and Western economists and experts, they felt very strongly the urge, and it was very noble urge, that throughout the world there are underdeveloped countries, there are countries that are poor, we need to assist them, and the assistance was going to be that we have got two things, expertise and money. And we can use expertise and money in order to ensure that throughout the world, poverty can be eradicated, development can be increased, and that is what, after the Second World War, we did. And economic growth was the mantra. And as you recall, experts all over the world, with loads of money, spent and without any results, because much of that money was wasted. People in those developing countries had no say in how that money was going to be utilized. Women were not empowered, and we find that it was a fiasco. And after that, the realization had grown that economic growth alone does not mean happiness, economic growth does not mean development, that these two are different terms. As you probably saw, Nobel laureate Amartya Sen, he had brought a perspective of development as freedom, the concept of human choices, capabilities, freedoms, and empowerment. The Economic Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD, it published a paper in 1996 and suggesting a set of international development goals. And here the thought was that we need to go beyond economic growth, and that is where we talked about human index, development index of the UNDP. But here, that 1996 effort, it then went to 2000, where at the UN headquarters, United Nations Millennium Declaration by the heads of states and governments was proclaimed. It enumerated human development goals along with the targets, a few targets, time frame to measure progress. The world leaders' commitment to reducing extreme poverty by creating a new global partnership, setting out a series of time-bound targets for the years 2000 and 2015, that became known as Millennium Development Goals. And here I might mention to you that perhaps we ought to take a minute or two, I won't dwell again on it, but let's go back to what sustainable development is and how it came into being. You might recall that 1972 in Stockholm, the United Nations had a conference on the environment. At that time, the setting was simple. Norway, Sweden, Denmark, they had experienced acid rain, and acid rain coming and hurting their own economy, their crops, their health, their animals, and they did not know what had caused that acid rain. They said, we know that from Europe, from that side, we have all those kind of acidic things coming here, but what countries are sending it? What companies are sending it, we don't know. But at the same time, we also don't know what remedy is available to us under international law. And that was the beginning of the effort to look at the environment and subsequently at development. In Stockholm, they did not talk about development. And there was a sharp divide between the North and South, global North and global South at that time. They were at odds. And at that time, it was the Prime Minister of India that had said that we need at the present time development, not simply the environmental issues. You, she said, developed countries have caused that problem. You, she said, ought to solve that. We need our poor to be fed. Problem of the environment is problem of poverty for us. And that was the kind of setting that divide began, and unfortunately that divide continues. Very briefly to look at the next steps, 1992 came, and that was the Rio conference. And as you remember, that conference was called the Earth Summit, and in that conference they did talk about the environment and development. Subsequently in Johannesburg, subsequently after that, 20 years later, again in Rio, and second time in Rio, the conference, and that is where sustainable development came into being. And sustainable development was the one where they thought that we would like to look not simply at economic growth and not simply at economic development, but social development. We ought to look at environmental issues. And a combination of all three as pillars would constitute then an effort on our part to create a setting in which what would we call sustainable development is the one that would bridge all these kind of gaps that we see with economic growth and all the other problems. Agenda 21, that was in 1992, and it set the stage for it, and later on whole lot of things happened, and finally we had the Millennium Declaration and Millennium Development Goals. These were 8 goals. I'll simply mention them. Eradicate extreme poverty and hunger. Then the second one was achieve universal primary education. Third, promote gender equality, empower women. Reduce child mortality. I need to look at the time so that promises to be kept. So what happened is that fourth one was reduce child mortality. Please don't. Fifth, improve mental health. Sixth, combat HIV, AIDS, malaria, and other diseases. Seventh, ensure environmental sustainability. 8, create a global partnership for development. Governments, foundations, businesses, civil society groups, they all pitched in. Whole lot of efforts were made, and 2015 came around, and starting in 2010, then at the United Nations, there was an effort to see that we continue this progress, momentum ought to continue, and perhaps in the next 15 years, what we have not been able to accomplish in these 15, we might be able to accomplish then. And here I need to mention to you, the figures are all here, and numbers are, some of them very successful in achieving the goals, some not. But 2 things I want to mention here about the Millennium Development Goals. One, human rights were not at the core. They looked at simply aggregated, this morning we also talked about no disaggregation. Extreme poverty to be halved, 50%. Well, you can do it. How? China did it, India did it. And with China and India, they would simply look at those percentages and say, we have reached our goal. Millennium Development Goals, they were drafted, they were put together by bureaucrats, United Nations officials, some World Bank, IMF officials, and they sat and they did it. So no wider participation at all. And so the report that came at the end of 2015, it was pretty sobering. There were success stories, but also the fact was that the most vulnerable, the poorest people, they were left behind. And so the thought was that now, starting in 2012, 11, 12, they thought that up to 2015, we ought to involve people. We ought to involve what rightly was said, that maybe there is no world community, there is no civil society as such, but there were millions of people around the world. They pitched in. They had their voices heard. And then the United Nations Secretary Generals, they did one after another great deal of work in order to see that that galvanization, that channelization, that took place, and took place appropriately. And so then came the Sustainable Development Goals, and I wanted to share with you some of the reports on the Millennium Development Goals, but I think I'll probably leave them out. I simply would mention two things. As I mentioned, especially the poorest and those disadvantaged because of their sex, age, disability, ethnicity, or geographical location. They were left behind. And gender inequality was not taken care of. Huge gaps existed between the poorest and richest households, between rural and urban areas. And that is where the effort began that, as I mentioned, that for 2015 to 2030, we ought to take care of it. Let me just mention to you, because I said that, but let me just elaborate on simply goal 1 on the eradication of poverty and what was found after 2015. The goal focused on the symptoms of poverty, failed to address the underlying causes. Nor did the poverty standard address the severity and depth of poverty. And I wrote this after looking at all those reports, while the 2015 MDG report on the progress of Target 1A, which calls for having between 1990 and 2015, the proportion of people whose income is less than US $1 per day, celebrates the decline of the number of people living in extreme poverty, but as I mentioned, it was China and India. It also acknowledged that over 40% of people living in sub-Saharan Africa still suffered from extreme poverty in 2015. And there is uneven distribution of extremely poor people across regions and countries. Southern Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa were home to about 80% of the global total of extremely poor people. And it goes on, about 1 billion such people. They 60% that live in just 5 countries out of those 1 billion suffering from that: India, Nigeria, China, Bangladesh, and the Democratic Republic of the Congo. So just to look at one of those goals. Came then the Sustainable Development Goals, and those goals are 17. The process, as I said, is much more inclusive, and the goals the process of getting there is a good one. I can't go over it, but kindly, if you are interested in it, do go over that journey from Millennium Development Goals to Sustainable Development Goals. And I had, I think, pretty much in depth looked into it, and if any of you are interested, I can happily send you that piece. 17 goals, poverty in all its forms everywhere. So now this is the main difference between Millennium and Sustainable Development Goals. Here, they did not talk about 50% reduction. They wanted to leave absolutely no one behind. So in all forms, everywhere. And it was not a focus on developing or developed countries. And it was universal: end hunger, achieve food security, improved nutrition, promote sustainable agriculture. Among these, we mentioned 3 or 4. Gender equality, achieve it. This time, not simply talking about all those aggregated, go beyond that. Empower all women and girls. Here, for the first time, talked about energy. Water and sanitation were there in the Millennium Development Goals too. Inequality, reduce inequality within and among countries, because as you probably know, that certainly India, China, some other countries have at least reduced inequality between and among countries because of that. But within countries, the inequality has continued to grow, and the United States and developed countries are no exception. Let me briefly then mention to you simply one part of it, and that is how can the international financial institutions help in it? Because a constant refrain in all these reports and all these talks at the United Nations by the world leaders is, we don't have resources. We don't have adequate technology. We don't have wherewithal in terms of expertise, skills. We need that. We need technology transfer, but technology that's appropriate and technology that we can afford. And so the effort at this time was that we ought to have international financial institutions especially help. And here I think you probably remember the Bretton Woods Agreement along with the United Nations and political order established after the Second World War. There was that international economic order. And out of that Bretton Woods, the twins were born, so-called twins. The International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. And the World Bank initially, it was focused on post-war reconstruction, infrastructure projects such as ports, such as railroads, such as dams. And in 1960 then, the International Development Association that wanted to improve living standards in developing countries, and therefore they had started the International Development Association to do that. I think here lot of discussion that I was going to do is on how initially the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, and especially in 1980s, started putting whole lot of conditions that were designed to see that the role of the state is reduced, privatization occurs, market becomes the mantra again, and austerity. Cut deficits. Try to see that you don't have inflation. And what was the outcome? Unemployment rose. What was the outcome? No growth. There was a decade lost in Latin America. You probably recall developing countries were crushed under the burden of credit. And the World Bank, International Monetary Fund that had the money, they said conditioned those loans, conditioned that help from the World Bank only on meeting those criteria, and criteria were privatization, criteria were markets, criteria were cut down regulations, and it went nowhere. That, you recall, probably many of you, was the Washington Consensus. And today what has happened is that after all that period, maybe 10 years totally lost, and then finally the realization had grown that yes, capitalism had won, communism had lost. Our role, our way of markets is the proper way. We understood that. But at the same time, what we are trying to do doesn't achieve the goals that we want to set, and that is we've been trying to create in the whole world a set of values, and it would be that at least in terms of economic growth, that growth continues and poverty is reduced. And so there was a gentler kind of approach. And what they did was added World Bank to focus on poverty. World Bank also tried talking about human rights. At one time, along with a couple of attorneys, the president of the World Bank had invited the three of us to come and talk to all the lawyers and the development experts on human rights. And we did. And then I followed, as many of you have followed, that although in rhetoric, both the World Bank and the IMF have talked about trying to have a gentler look and not simply looking at the conditionality. A very good example of that was 2014, when Christine Lagarde, the managing director of the IMF, was asked about conditionality. And she had a quizzical look. And she said, conditionality? What conditionality? I haven't heard about it. That was before my time. And the fact is that that rhetoric is there, but the reality is that it's cosmetic changes mostly. So what I want to say then is that the time has come that these international financial institutions step up, that they have developing countries, emerging countries have some say in it. Still, the United States has 16% plus voting rights and investment in all these, and therefore, because of that, you find that there is a veto that the United States has, because 85% votes needed, US has 16 plus. And these countries, Japan, Germany, United Kingdom, 4 or 5 countries, they have at the present time almost 60% of the votes. So this is the kind of setting where the need is that the international financial institutions move up. The change has occurred, is occurring. China is giving money for infrastructure without conditionality. At the same time, it has got its own axe to grind. And so we are again in a difficult time. But at the same time, the time has come where, although private banks today, private countries, sovereign money, all that is there, that there are other avenues open. And so World Bank and the IMF also have got to change. But the time has come that the developing countries, despite that economic inequality, that they have a say in what happens in these financial institutions, and so that economic inequality does not remain a great impediment that today it is to the accomplishment of achievement of sustainable development goals 444. Thank you.